You are listening to Art Destinations, a podcast where we host fortnightly conversations with artists and thinkers living and or working on islands to see how these unique places shape imaginations. This season will be set in Tasmania, following on from our Venice series. Hello, my name is Sarah Rhodes, an artist based in Lutruwita, Tasmania. We are in conversation with Troy Ruffels, a photomedia artist drawing on the tradition of painting and drawing to make works that are both immersive and atmospheric. Troy incorporates the elements of fire and water into his daily routine, from pre-dawn ocean swims to evening fire pits, creating a discipline for his art practice. As a country boy growing up in Forth on Tasmania's northwest coast, Troy's career was launched at Sydney's Museum of Contemporary Art's Primavera exhibition for emerging artists in 1997. Since then, he has continued his exploration of boundaries through the mediums he uses or the poetic language to evoke the atmosphere of weather. Troy lectures at University of Tasmania's School of Creative Art and is represented by Bett Gallery in Hobart. You can see Troy's work on our Instagram page, artdestinations.podcast. Subscribe to Art Destinations on your hosting platform so you don't miss an episode, and even leave a review. Your contribution supports us. Hi Troy, welcome to Art Destinations. It's great to have you here.
Hi Sarah, it's great to be here.
So I've known you for the last probably 7 years since I moved to Tasmania actually, and you've been really supportive with my practice, and this is a really lovely opportunity to hear a little bit more about your practice. So you've been travelling from Forth, where you live, to Launceston for most of the week working at the art school. Over the time that I've known you, you've got this beautiful routine of going for a swim at Turner's Beach to start the day and then making the trip. First of all, I'd like to know a little bit about your connection to Forth and what keeps you there.
Yeah, no, Forth's a pretty special place. One, there's a strong family connection to the environment, and I actually live in my grandmother's house, which as a child was one of my favourite places in terms of just navigating the garden, playing word games, playing Scrabble, writing stories and inventing worlds. And it's a place I'd go to at every opportunity just to spend time with her. There came a time in, I guess, my and my partner's life where we, chance takes you in roundabouts. And we were kind of sitting down after, doing a lot of travel internationally and deciding where we wanted to base ourselves. And we were thinking about Melbourne or Sydney or moving to my partner's hometown of Glasgow. And a set of, occurrences just fell into place where we ended up in Forth. And to this day, it's probably one of the best chance events that happened because it shaped our lives ever since. The Northwest Coast is a really beautiful part of the world. There's a lot of sea and a lot of sky and a lot of weather and a lot of space. And that really shapes our engagement with the world and was the environment that we chose to raise our daughter in as well. It comes with a lot of atmosphere. And I think that probably leads on to the other component of the question about routine and swims and where my work is grounded, because I think that kind of atmosphere and weather of the northwest coast of Tasmania, my routine in general, I like patterns. Patterns are very grounding. Routine and repetition put you into situations on a regular basis. There's no excuse not to do it. You simply do it. And by being present, you're forced to immerse yourself in an environment. And then you experience that environment or that space and navigate those kind of internal and external emotional machinations, whether they're your own internal state of being or the weather that's competing with you, and somehow find a balance or an equilibrium between them. And, routine or repetition or patterns are a good way of grounding practice as well. And certainly that's how I build a lot of projects, is just by visiting places regularly over long periods of time until I have enough material to work with, or until an idea galvanizes just around the mass or the critical weight that accumulates over time. Patterns can be negative, but, for me, as long as you're aware of the pattern, so the morning swims, which began initially during COVID, during the lockdown phase, just as a way of engaging with the world and the ocean, which is a space I love. I'm from the coast. Yeah, it was just that kind of wake up. It just amplified that first breath of the day, because if you swim in cold water, when you kind of surface, you take your first real breath of the day, and it just makes you incredibly present and I guess mindful of the space you occupy, of the world you inhabit, of the values you have and want to project into that space through everything else that you do. It's also, a place of solitude, which, is a condition I enjoy. I like time to myself, to ponder the world I inhabit, to think through and to process things. And I place a great deal of value on that time alone, but not alone, not alone because I'm with the world and I'm with myself. So those things together, just make for that kind of, experiential immersion, conscious of myself and my own body, conscious of the world in which it's located, and conscious and mindful of everything else that exists outside of that. And that these are very thin membranes that separate one from the other. And that's just kind of a way of thinking I carry through life and through my work.
What I find intriguing is you're so responsive and organic. You work so organically, but you also are quite routine-based. And so I guess it's the structure that the routine provides that allows you to be so fluid. Because often people who are so disciplined aren't very malleable, or they're not very flexible. So anyway, I think it's quite nice. You're lucky to have that balance.
Yeah, in some ways it just provides that kind of scaffolding. It means you don't have to think about some things. It means you license your subconscious, your imagination. It takes pressure off being consciously aware of everything you're capturing or what you're moving towards, and allows you to be a little bit more spontaneous, a little bit more organic in terms of the way you embrace those spaces. And it means you have intention, but not the intention of a hunter who's there for something very specific. And sometimes when you focus on very specific things, you miss everything else. And my way of generally trying to inhabit spaces is to absorb the whole. And what I'm looking for only surfaces after a duration of time or an accumulation of visits allows something to surface more freely and in some ways. But that kind of idea of just taking the pressure off, it's almost as, and it's like the studio routine, it's just like you call yourself an artist, so you just make sure you spend, a full-time, 40 hours in the studio a week. And sometimes you may accomplish absolutely nothing, but by just showing up, and it's the advice I give to students. Half the battle is just show up. If you just show up regularly and do the work, you'll get there in the end. So, routine is in some ways a way of holding oneself to account. It means I go to the studio and sometimes I daydream and sometimes I get bored and sometimes I get frustrated and sometimes I come out dancing. But all of those emotional states and that frustration and that boredom and that daydreaming are all ways of thinking, and you're problem solving the whole time and you're engaged the whole time in that shared space. And for me, I think that's a really valuable use of time because it leads to outcomes.
I know with photography, actually, if you go somewhere and you make a rule that you can't come home until this particular time is up, even if you're not in the mood, it's usually, you get really bored, and then once you get through the other side, something special will happen, and it's pretty exciting. So you've got this studio down the bottom of your garden, and you have a lovely weatherboard cottage, and with this beautiful sort of rambling garden with this fire pit, and you have this lovely ritual as well of sitting by the fire pit, actually in the day and in the night, depending on what you're up to. So nature and the elements are like a really key part of your work. Fire is something that is synonymous with Troy Ruffels. Yeah, do you want to talk about how, your fire in your daily life and then fire in your work, what the relationship is with fire?
Look, again, it's that kind of immersion or immersing yourself in the world. We live outside. We spend a lot of time outside. In fact, every opportunity. And often the weather draws you outside. So it's that crystal clear, starlit night, or that heavy downpour of rain, or that beautiful storm coming off the ocean. That's when you go outside. You don't shelter from those situations, you embrace them. And that's something that's been a part of my life, for as long as I can remember. The minute you feel a storm front coming in is the minute you got excited about going to the beach, or the minute you go out running through the bush reserve, because the smells and the activity in the underscrub and the whole space comes to life in different ways. And drawing from those kind of atmospheric conditions, or loving being immersed in atmosphere and having the weather kind of push against you. It's almost like, I'm going to push back. I belong here too. I want to exist. I choose to exist. And the weather kind of, or the wind kind of presses against you. I don't know, we're going to move you along a little bit. And I kind of like that kind of idea of not resistance, but kind of, it just makes you acutely aware of being here. And kind of, again, it comes back to that idea of presence and awareness of self in some ways. Those kind of elemental forces, water, fire, and then flood, etc., are kind of key kind of metaphors or visual metaphors that I use frequently within my practice. A lot of the work is about weight, is about gravity, is about tone, and it's the way, you kind of welcomed in or pushed out. So how light falls or how heavy something feels. And in the imagery, a lot of the challenge is to shift weight in an image, to gather and accumulate it, or to lighten or draw it out in other spaces. So, and they're pretty universal metaphors of, renewal, life cycles, the transience of, or the temporality of, our time here. And again, that just reminds you in useful ways of how precious, this time and this experience in this world is. And it's a world that's just full of so much kind of wonder and beauty as well, which again, I try to shy away from trying to capture in the work.
Ronnie Horn, the US artist, they go to Iceland to make their work. And I actually came across Ronnie Horn through you. And the island of Iceland is something which they describe as that it makes them acutely aware of being, of that the weather heightens the sense of themselves, which is kind of what you were describing, that obviously, not being on an island, you would experience similar things, but on the island, traveling around, you kind of find yourself on the edge quite easily, especially if you're making your way around the coast, or, you've got these sort of track lines between Forth and Hobart and Launceston, and you can take long cuts to go through nature, and you might take your camera with you. And maybe on a continent as opposed to an island, you might experience the same sort of things, but it's potentially the idea of being enclosed or contained that heightens the sense. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think I would. I think Ronnie Horn probably expresses it far more articulately than I can. That was a beautiful kind of quote or line or reference. I'll have to write that one down about weather amplifying experience, which I think it does. And I think that's something about island, or being on an island or islandness, is that there are these boundaries, these borders, if you want to call them that, or that it kind of localizes or determines a geographic space, a physical space that you have to work with. And again, localizing my own practice has been a really important aspect of its development since I was a student, actually recognizing the value of the local, of recognizing the value of actually knowing something about something, even if that knowing is not knowing, and looking to your own world, what's beneath your own feet, and starting to build from there as a place where you have some understanding. And even though you're kind of zooming out, in terms of my kind of photographic practice or image making practice, it is focused on this island, on Tasmania, on its environments, on its mountains, on its seas, on its, rural and pastoral zones. I traverse it, like you said, with camera in car. I really quite enjoy driving as well and being sheltered from the weather. And again, it's that kind of, drawing from that knowledge base. So it's all of those mental, or all of those kind of observations you stow away about how the dynamics of this space work, and seeing it forth on a morning and looking out towards the ocean in the north and going, the conditions are just right. The light's just right. But I need to be 200 kilometres from where I am right now because I can anticipate, or I've got an idea of what it might be like there based on what I'm seeing here. And then you kind of just jump in the car and go when you're able to, of course. That kind of knowing of anticipating atmosphere, weather, light in that kind of very organic way of, well, particularly as, I'm not a straight photographer. I work in kind of an expanded photographic practice. So most of my images are constructed images and built from a multitude of layers, or many, many layers. And therefore, I may be looking for the most abstract, warm cloud of light. And that's what I'm waiting for. And just kind of recognizing again in the weather that that's going to be there, again, it gets you out. It gets you kind of on the road and chasing something or collecting something. And often on the way you stumble across something else that's far more relevant or important, or that you weren't looking for until you found it.
That's a nice segue, because I'm interested in the beginning of your practice. So you started the photomedia when digital photography was probably becoming more accessible, and you were a painter and a drawer to start with, and then you sort of shifted to using the camera as well. Someone found your work and invited you to be part of the MCA's Primavera for celebrating the best emerging artists of that early career artists of 1997, which would have been an amazing opportunity. So I'm interested in what took you to that place where you decided to be experimenting and pushing new boundaries. How did you get that idea? And then from there, how has your work evolved?
It's a long time ago, 1997, really. Look, again, I think I put a lot of it down to chance, maybe chance, and no, chance is different from luck, I think. And I'd probably apply that to the way my practice evolved and also the way opportunities surfaced. It's interesting looking back that, I came very much from a painterly space, that kind of more human expressive mark making and rendering through paint. But I think always in the background there was something else I was looking for. And it just so happened that towards the end of my degree, when I'd found my feet at art school, and that was, it's meant to be challenging going to university. It's certainly as a boy from the Northwest Coast, it was a big dive, and it took a little while to, to find my feet in that space. But it kind of just coincided with, as I found my feet and came to value the local and the spaces I knew and trust myself, those kind of emerging, the first Mac lab was, and it was a small one, was established in the university, and the first colour printer arrived, and this whole digital space, started to emerge, not just in the specific sense of photography, but as a way to, as a platform of convergence of a space where, those kind of warm, expressive marks of painting and drawing and print could be combined with those kind of cooler lens-based qualities of photography and film and cinema, and all kinds of things could happen. And I think it was largely that capacity to bring together that kind of human touch, that human expression, that warmth with the accuracy and some of the other characteristics that photography or lens-based image capture is probably a better term for it, offered to create something new. So it was, it just kind of fell into place. And then thankfully as a result of that, I did my honours and then went on to do some postgraduate study as the digital art research facility was set up at the Hobart School of Art in Hunter Street. And as part of that, was lucky enough to work with a great team of people. I was there as a kind of a student engaged in the project, but you had Jeff Parr, Pat Brasington, Milan Milojevic, Bill Hart, Mary Knights, Martin Walsh, and a number of other people involved in that, which was largely focused on how to change the nature of the print, or how to challenge what was possible. So we just had this large format inkjet printer and was just kind of rebuilding it or making it do things differently. Like some people wanted to look at opacity and I wanted to explore translucency. So my project largely involved building images through layering silk dyes, one layer upon another, almost like glazing a painting. And, 20 layers later, you'd put the last little coat of umber on and you'd be finished. And that body of work was the body of work that Ree picked for that year's Primavera, along with another Tasmanian artist was also that year, which was terrific. Again, it was a wonderful opportunity. It was so very well supported by the MCA and the staff and the team and the philanthropists that support that. And still very green. I mean, I think everything I've done, I've been out of my comfort zone. I think when I showed up in Sydney, I was still a country boy. I was like, and a bit naive. And I showed up at, a year later, I was in New York at another show, and I was still a country boy, very naive. But look, it's just been a wonderful journey.
It's pretty impressive, growing up in Forth as a country boy, as you say, and then ending up in the MCA at not even 30, probably not even 25. We won't need to count. No, we won't go there. So how has your work evolved from then? What are you experimenting with? What are the questions that you're asking in terms of, your process?
Look, the work continues to explore themes of landscape, what it is to be here in this place. In some ways, it does carry with it some kind of aspect of negotiating, ecology, ideas of belonging, ideas of place or placelessness sometimes. And the world we inhabit, I think that's very poorly expressed, but...
Not really, I think it was quite good.
Yeah, and look, it just continues to evolve. So, like everything, particularly when you work in digital media or spaces where technology is evolving, which is a lot of them, often changes in technology change the currency or the inherent reading of certain media and material. For instance, with the work that I was doing early on, I was printing onto canvas to reference that kind of painting tradition. It was also necessary in terms of it was the only support that could carry and absorb the sheer amount of ink that was being printed onto it through that layering process. But, the minute you could go and get a photo printed at Harvey Norman on canvas, which is a great process. And, you see people delight in having their family photos. But essentially, the minute that was available at that level, it changed the currency. It changed the intellectual kind of space that I was working with. So you quickly it just stops and you go, well, that's that part done. And that's really quite great as well, because it means you then have to look for something else to work with. And I was lucky that I started working in response to that through a few public artworks. And again, it's what starts off often as quite practical. I need to find a way of making an image last outside for 15 years. What processes are available to me to do this? And then through that, coming across, photo-anodized aluminium printing processes, and then others that have surfaced since then, and going, wow, reflected light. I really like this. And it changes the whole dynamic of the image because you're working with, a highlight that's shifting as the environment around it changes. And that kind of had a lovely synergy with the way I think of landscape itself, in terms of being immersed within it, being a dynamic presence within it, and both you and the landscape altering around each other. So the idea of actually working with images on metal plates and mirror plates and having an image change and open up to you as you moved across it was really exciting. That came out of, a very, trying to be very pragmatic and earn some money through public art. I'm still doing work that kind of speaks to, the daguerreotype in terms of printing onto mirror and creating this kind of really luscious kind of depth, while also talking to that kind of early photographic processes. And at the same time, exploding that out into much larger scale works where you're able to, again, play or move between representation and abstraction. And I love it when a figurative work or a representational work dissolves into abstraction and welcomes you. And certainly the scale of print technology or the flatbed printers today make that kind of realistic and possible. So, the notion of actually having these large immersive works that can be both abstract and representational at the same time and change in accordance or in response to their surroundings, still captivates me, and still having a lot of fun with that.
Yeah, you're really interesting as a person who is always looking forward. You're always sort of seeing what technologies or ideas are at the forefront and then experimenting with them, never just happy with your process. That's really nice. Now, if I ever need to go and watch a film and I need inspiration, I will always ask you first what I should see. So do you use cinema as an inspiration? Do films help you visualise the images that you're wanting to make?
I love movies and I do love cinema and music. And I think in some ways the works I gravitate to, again, reflect that kind of that quality of immersion, of losing yourself to a space, to a moment, to something unfolding. And certainly they're the types of works I'm drawn to. And the same with music. Philip Glass, Oliver Arnolds, those types of contemporary musicians whose music kind of, it has these layers to it, but also this kind of hypnotic repetition and this depth. I can only approach it kind of as a lay person who listens to it, but they create these really kind of meditative and highly kind of emotive states that carry me along. And I really enjoy, that quality and draw from that in trying to capture an equivalence almost. So again, it's a kind of about rhythms and harmonies and discords and repetition and immersion. I think both cinema and music and also poetry kind of rich in texture and often kind of challenge that kind of the usual or the familiar. So I draw from them a lot, but more in terms of just that equivalence.
Okay, that's a beautiful answer. I like it when, the choice of music or cinema or the arts really plays into your process. There is a really strong parallel between those two. I really like it when that happens. So Karen Hall is a colleague, a friend, and also someone who writes really well or beautifully about your work. And she wrote a catalogue essay in 2017 for your exhibition, Between Fire and Flood. She uses a line from Emily Dickinson's poem, You Cannot Put a Fire Out. She says, Emily Dickinson's seemingly impossible statement, you cannot fold a flood and put it in a drawer, suggests that what registers initially as an intrusion into the ordinary turns out to have been there all along. A flood need not just be an event, it stands in for a state of constant influx. What do you think Karen means by this in reference to your work?
I think what Karen is referring to, and the reason I gave her that particular poem to look at, is the idea that certain experiences, emotions and states of being are too vast, are too uncontrollable to be contained or explained. Like a flood, like any natural phenomena, is an emotional force, can overwhelm us, but it also reveals something that was always there beneath the surface, something we may not have noticed before, And in the work, I often address this idea of flux, of this twofold movement of duality, of multiple perspectives or points of view coexisting harmoniously in every space. And that these are forces that can't be compartmentalized or controlled. So again, I think it links back to that idea of weather, but also emotion and states of being and that duality of existence, which kind of, for me at least, is kind of resonant within most of the work I make.
So would you have had Emily Dickinson's poem in your mind when you were making the work, or was it something that you found afterwards that you really related to?
I knew the poem. It's like a lot of things. Like, I knew it, but then I was looking for something. I was working on a body of work called Between Fire and Flood, which was in part a response to a series of severe weather events in Tasmania that had both seen, in a relatively short period of time, pretty catastrophic flooding across the island, but also raging bushfires in alpine zones where they don't usually occur, and where they, did so much damage that will take, hundreds or perhaps thousands of years to recover because they're so unaccustomed to fire. And again, it was thinking about this space and these changes in this world we live in, and all these competing voices that want to be heard, and seeking this kind of balance that we can't seem to find. And then I just, had to find that poem and reread it. And in rereading it, thought the way it speaks about that kind of coexistence, or about, I just thought it was appropriate. So acknowledged that and referenced it in the other statement and the information I sent out about the show, in terms of it being something that's brought it together.
So your most recent show, Stone Tide Sweeping Trees, was made in collaboration with Kristen Lang, the poet. You worked alongside her, or how did you work with her? Because in your exhibition there was her poems and your artworks in the gallery space. So what was the process?
Look, really fortunate to work with Kristen in that space on that project. As a poet, I'd kind of followed for quite a time and had a lot of respect for. Look, there's lots of forms of collaboration, and there's lots of benefits of collaboration. In this particular case, we kind of came together around this project kind of midway through. So in some ways it was the model of collaboration where I do my thing and Kristen does her thing, but we're in a conversation. And that allows us to, well, it allowed my work to be influenced by seeing some of the writing that Kristen was developed. And I hope in return, Kristen was shaping some of those poems on visiting the Highlands, on seeing some of the early works I'd created in response to the cider gums and the Central Highland Plateau space, and generated her own unique and kind of finalised work. So, this is probably the model I prefer, in my own practice, is that, I generate my outcome and someone generates their outcome. But in the dialogue between those two things, something is gained and something surfaces that wouldn't have been possible unless those two pieces were in play together. And I still remember when, because Kristen recorded the poems and has a really kind of beautiful speaking voice. And I remember when she sent me through the first recordings, I was driving home at night and I nearly wept. At that point, I think, in the poems that Kristen realised, it was like, that's captured what I couldn't capture. And I know from Kristen, she probably would think that, the images. But no, I was really rapt with the outcome and with the work she brought to bear upon that show, and for the important dialogue they opened up within the space, in being able to move between that kind of poetic, written response and the images. And again, just having them sit comfortably with each other in the same space led to something even better, being present in that space that was neither the poem itself nor the visual work on the wall itself.
But they could both stand alone. Each medium has its own language, and so the collaboration, you can show each other your work as you're both developing, and it can influence each other, but you're still working on your own. Could you imagine collaborating with someone in the same medium?
I can imagine anything, Sarah. No, again, that's a very different type of collaboration. And like I said, that can be really valuable. I've worked on kind of more joint projects where you have equal authorship over an artifact or a project you're developing, and they can be really productive, insightful, challenging in terms of stimulating new ways of working. And that's really positive for everybody involved. The thing with all forms of collaboration is to go in from the very beginning, understanding the nature or the agreement you're going into. Yeah, look, I think as long as there's no ambiguity, because you don't want people competing for authorship or ownership. And that's the only really important thing with collaboration. My preferred model remains, just let me do my poetic thing and develop a work and work with people in other disciplines, in other areas of specialisation to bring another additional perspective, knowledge base, process to the project. So it's kind of like almost an artist working with a scientist. There can be really mutually beneficial for both, but the artist is still the artist and the scientist is still the scientist.
Particularly in the Venice season, actually, there were quite a few artists who were working with people who were almost sort of social scientists or, lawyers, psychologists, anthropologists, to bring other perspectives to their work without having to share how they're visualising it. So they didn't have to compromise, but it kind of added some depth to the project. I think that's a really lovely way to finish, actually. I think that we really covered some beautiful topics and I got a really great sense of your approach, so thank you very much.
No, thank you, Sarah.
Thank you for listening to the 4th episode of Art Destinations Tasmania. Be reminded about our next episode by subscribing to our fortnightly newsletter on our website artdestinations.org. I'm your host, Sarah Rhodes. Ciao for now.